One thing I want to do on our Sunday nights is look at some of the songs that are in our hymnals, songs that we sing oftentimes, who are written by members of the Lord's church. And so JD picked this song out, and I didn't even tell him to pick this out. I didn't even tell him this is what the sermon was about. I called Scott the other day, and Scott told me that JD already had it. And I thought, well, no pressure here. I just won't even mention it to him until we have it. So I'm glad you didn't change your mind. And so that's what we're going to look at. It's one of my favorite songs. It was written in 1910. If you look, it's in our books. It's been a while since we've sung out of our book, so it's hard for me to remember. Should be 470, if I'm not mistaken. So 470 is where it is in our book. You remember we used to have our language, 528B, and all the different songs that come across, and number 10, and depending on whether you use the blue book, the yellow book, or the red book, that used to be our secret language back and forth. And so in the first century, the way a person would communicate to one another that they were a Christian is they would make a half of a fish in the mud, and the other person that they were talking to would make the other half of the fish, and that was ikathes, or Jesus Christ is the Son of God would be the acronym. That was the first century. Now we've gotten lazy to the point where we say 728B, and if their eyes light up, that means they're fellow members of the church. But that's another sermon. All right, 470. Is it 470? 570. All right, well, see, it's going to be a short lesson if I don't even have the number. William M. Gooden, as you see him up here, 1918 is when the song was published. The arrangement, which we have in our book, was changed by Alton Howard about 30 years ago from this point. Now, when you look up this fella on the internet, you're not going to run across very much. A lot of people think that he is related to the fella in the Oak Ridge Boys that has a long beard. And if you don't know who the Oak Ridge Boys are, ask your grandparents. But we don't know exactly one way or the other because there's not many people who anymore will confess to being related to him or to know him. This is one of my favorite songs written by him. The other favorite song written by him is To Canaan's Land, I'm on My Way. And that used to be 585 in the blue book. I don't know what it is in this book, and I'm not going to guess anymore because I've already messed up. But Canaan's Land, I'm on my way, and each day I'll do. Those are two of the songs which he put together. He was a person who had a knack for putting music together. And as far as I know, he's the only person, as far as people who wrote hymns in our book, that spent a third of his life in prison. He made a mistake later in life in an angered fight. He didn't listen to the words of this song, and that's one of the reasons why you don't find very much about him on the internet as far as his biography. But when he wrote this song, the words that come through it talk very simply and plainly about what you do to be a Christian, about how we go through and living the way in which God wants us to live and doing the things that God wants us to do. Each day I'll do a golden deed by helping those who are in need. My life on earth is but a span, and so I'll do the best that I can. And you go through and you see the chorus, life's evening sun is sinking low, just a few more days, and I must go to meet the deeds that I have done, where there will be no more setting sun. So in looking at this and thinking about this fella who lived over a century ago, what are some lessons that you and I learn from this book? We're going to look at three basic lessons fairly quickly. The first lesson is to be a Christian, it's important to serve God, and it's important to serve other people. You know the golden rule, don't you? And as the book or the song opens up, each day I'll do a golden deed by helping those who are in need. You've heard of the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Or as Jesus puts it in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12, whatever it is that you want men to do to you, you also do to them, for this summarizes the law and the prophets. Matthew 22, 37 through 40, when people ask Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? It wasn't circumcision, it wasn't the dietary laws, it wasn't the methods of sacrifice that you read of in Leviticus chapter 1 through 4. It was this: you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. And the second commandment is like it unto this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus says all the law, all the prophets, all the Old Testament, and we would say today all the New Testament hangs on those two commandments. Love God and love people. Those are the two most important things that we're called to do. Now, as you go to the next verse, to be a child of God each day, my light must shine along the way. That reminds us of the importance of being a good example to other people. And one of the best ways that you can serve people is by living a good Christian life. This morning was Father's Day, and as we talked about Father's Day and the importance of fathers, and as we passed out the pins earlier today, it's sometimes hard in modern society to talk about Father's Day. And that's because a lot of families, especially in American culture, don't have men who fulfill their obligation and fulfill their role to their spouses or to their children. And so many people, when we talk to them about how God is our Father, they picture with the word Father something that it should not be, something which is bad rather than something which is good. Living in that culture as Christians today, one of the greatest forms of evangelism that you can do is to determine to live a Christian life. Live in a way in which when people see you, they recognize there's something different about you. Live in such a way when people see you, they see Jesus living in you. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, you are the light of the world. If a city is set up on a hill, it's seen by everybody. You don't light a lamp and put it under a basket. No, you put it up on a lampstand so it will fill the entire room with its light. You're the salt of the earth. But if salt loses its saltiness, what is it good for? But to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. Matthew 5:17, therefore let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Now, I'm not saying that every one of us is perfect, because we're not. But over this past week at work, over this past week as you've been doing whatever it is that you do each day, when people see you and they hear the language you use and they see the actions that you do, and when they see the way you treat other people, are you someone who brings people closer to Jesus? Or are you someone who ends up being an obstacle, being a barrier for them to come to Jesus when they find out that you are a member of the Lord's church? And that's an obligation for every single one of us. As a matter of fact, every one of us has that role to be an example to other people. 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 12, Paul says this to the young man Timothy, let no one despise or look down upon your youth, but you be an example to the believers in your word, your conduct, in your spirit, in your faith, and in your purity, so that people will see Jesus in you. That applies to young people. That applies to older people. That applies to people who have been Christians for a long time, and that applies to brand new New Testament Christians. Every one of us is to be an example in the role in which we live. Now looking there at verse 4, you serve others by helping them. While going down on life's weary road, I'll try to lift some traveler's load. I'll try to turn their night today and make flowers bloom along the way. So we read there in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 15. Paul writes, render no person evil for evil. In other words, don't get revenge, but instead show goodness and show love to each one of them. Don't be the kind of person that always wins every argument and wins every fight. That may feel good at first, and it may, make you feel powerful. That's not what Jesus is about. Show good to those who are evil. Show kindness. Bring people to Jesus, people who don't deserve it, and people who don't know who Jesus is. The writer of Hebrews in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 16 says, do good and share what you have with other people. And so we serve others. Secondly, I want us to notice that there is a level of pure living that we're called to do. We are called to live pure. We see that in verses 2 and 3. I'll sing his praises while ages roll and strive to help some troubled soul. Singing praises to God. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 15, let us offer to God our sacrifice. What is the sacrifice that we offer? It's not goats, not sheep, not lambs, not cattle. What is it that we're told to offer unto God? First of all, Romans 12:1 says our bodies, but what is it we're told specifically to offer to God in the book of Hebrews? The fruit of our lips. The words that you say are a sacrifice to God. The words that you say is your everyday worship to God. Now, James will remind us when you look in his book that the tongue is impossible to train. You may think you have it trained. You may think you always have it perfect. And then the moment comes where something slips out that was supposed to stay in, where you should have said something, but you never spoke up. And James talks about how it's like a small spark that destroys a forest. It's like a small rudder that directs a boat and where it's going. You've got to control your tongue. And so Hebrews 13 says your way of worshiping God, your way of showing God where he belongs in your life is the way that you use your tongue. Now, that's not just talking about cussing. It's talking about gossip. It's talking about slander. It's talking about, on a positive side, encouragement, edification, building people up. And one that's really hard for Christians, not just Christians, more so preachers, sometimes it's good to be silent. Now, nobody say amen to that. But sometimes we have to learn not to speak. Sometimes we have to learn, as the Jews would do in the Old Testament, to observe the Passover and just let it go, and to not be there for that occasion. You see, we need to help other people. Psalm 107:21 says, "Oh, give thanks to God for his goodness." Another verse here, the only life that will endure is one that's kind and good and is pure. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 8, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." How do you become pure in heart? First thing you have to do is remove the impurities. That's something that's pretty difficult to do. You have to go through your life and take out those parts that are not good. Take out those parts that are not positive. And then you have to fill your life with good things. And as a Christian, that's something that you're going to do for the rest of your life, is focusing on putting into your heart good things and removing those evil things that are out of your life so that you can put God first in every single thing that you do. You see, you do it by making sure your life is righteous before God. In James chapter 1 and verse 27, James says, "Pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this, that you keep yourself away from worldly things, and then you look after orphans and widows in their distress." There are things that you remove, and there are things that you add. Some people's concept of Christianity is all the stuff that you shouldn't do. But God goes beyond that, because there's much that you should do. And so the only life that will endure is one that's kind and good and pure. Now looking at verse 3, "And so for God I will take my stand, and each day I'll lend to others a helping hand." Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10 talks about taking a stand for God, putting him first in everything that you do. If you're faithful even to the point of death, you will, he says, receive a crown of life. Ephesians chapter 6. When you read in that passage, you begin looking there in verse 10, right? "Therefore stand up with the whole might and the power of God, for we do not wrestle against principality, or we do not wrestle against this world, but instead against principalities and powers and those forces of darkness." When you look at the original language, those are different categories or ranks of evil angels. And so what Paul is saying here is you and I are engaged in a spiritual warfare. Sometimes we think that our enemies are somebody, at church who we don't get along with, or somebody at work who doesn't seem to be right with us, or somebody who mistreated us at school. And what Paul is saying here in Ephesians 6 is it goes beyond that. It's not people you're fighting, it's Satan. And beyond that, it's not even Satan that you're fighting, it's yourself. Yes, Satan walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour, and Satan's goal is to bring you with him as he spends eternity in hell. But Satan gets a vote, and of course God gets a vote. Guess who has the deciding vote? It's you. When you go to those gates of heaven on that final day for the day of judgment, you'll answer for what you've done, not for what Satan has done. If you follow Jesus, you will be covered by the blood of Christ, but it really comes down to your fight. It really comes down to your life, and it really comes down to your choices. And that's why in Ephesians 6, Paul begins writing about this armor that you wear, the breastplate of righteousness, the helmet of salvation. As you look through all those different things, you see that God gives you everything you need to win in this battle, everything you need to be able to do well. Many years ago in the Iraq War, I think the second one, depending on how you number the Iraq wars, Norman Schwarzkopf was giving a report about a battle which the U.S. had won. And as he was describing it, one of the reporters there was talking to him about maybe they had brought too many tanks, maybe they had used too many cruise missiles. It seemed to be overkill to that person. And what Norman Schwarzkopf replied to that person is, in our army, he says, we do not believe in an even match. We don't believe in an even battle. You always want to overwhelm and win. I think God knows that as well, doesn't he? God doesn't believe in even battles. And so if you put your trust in him, if you follow him, if you put him first in everything that you do, we are more than conquerors, as Romans 8 would say, and we shall overcome. He who is with God shall always overcome and shall reign forever and ever. Now, as we look at the chorus, we recognize mortality. Now, mortality is something that we know intellectually, but it's not something we accept in our heart. So often we realize life only has a certain number of days. And many times we realize that life does not last forever, and we see it as our friends and our acquaintances will pass away. But many times it takes a while to realize that you and I, we're temporary. We won't be here much longer. Our life's sun is beginning to sink low. That's better than just a good baseline there. Life's sun is sinking low. What do you do knowing that life may come to an end? Well, Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 1 tells us to remember our Creator at this very moment. Solomon, as he's writing to young people, it appears, as he's closing this book, says, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. And he begins describing vividly what old age feels like and what old age looks like. And he says, while you have opportunity, put God first. The earlier you turn to God, the easier it will be. Recognize your mortality. Recognize that life's sun is sinking low. James puts it a different way. James chapter 4, 13 through 15 says, in every decision that you make, you need to realize that you're here on borrowed time. You've got to remember that you don't get to say, well, tomorrow we're going to do such and such, and in a year we're going to do such and such. Our life is no more than a vapor, here today and gone tomorrow. It's a sad thing to recognize that we don't know what tomorrow holds, and we don't know what our future says. But God holds us in his hand, and he will guide us in the way that he wants us to go. Life's sun is sinking low. In a few days, I must go. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 7 tells us that our bodies are dust, and to this earth we will return, and our spirits will return to God. Psalm chapter 90 and verse 10 tells us that we only have a certain number of years to live. And so we need to be ready always to meet our Maker. You see, we'll meet God and we'll give an account for our deeds, as appointed to man once to die, and then the judgment. In Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 14, God will bring every work into judgment. You see, it's a simple song. It's a simple line with a beautiful bass line that goes along. But it's a song that teaches us so much about what it means to be a Christian. What is it teaching us? Well, as we just looked at, it teaches us to serve other people, and that is the basis of success for our life. It tells us that by serving other people, we show God how much we appreciate him and show God how much we love him. This song teaches us not just about serving other people, it tells us about living pure and putting God first in every decision that we make, watching what comes into our heart and removing those things in our heart that separate us from God. It teaches us not just about serving other people, not just about living pure, but recognizing that every day that you and I live is a gift from God. And one day, these days will come to an end. One day, our lives will be finished and we'll be ready to meet our Maker and we'll be with him forevermore. And so in this lesson, as we hear these words spoken, written over a century ago by William Golden, it reminds us to live as a Christian. He was a man who ran into trouble in the later years of his life, but he had a talent. And the beauty of that talent that he had was he used it to serve God. Imagine writing a poem or imagine writing some music and having people over 100 years recite it and know it by memory. It's an amazing thing that a songwriter can do.